Hello, and welcome to this episode of 10,000 Posts. It's the show about how everything is posting. My name is Hussein. I don't know if I sound weird on this one. I'm in a kind of newish recording place for reasons, and all I can say is that it's very dark and very small.
Hussein is joining us from his underground bunker. Interpol are after him, so if you do know his location, please do not disclose it. I'm Phoebe. I have an answer to a question from a listener from the episode that was out last week, which was asking for my new calendar, what I'm going to do with November. Am I going to make October and December longer? But I'm reorganizing the whole calendar. Like, I'm not going to make any months longer or shorter. It's going to be a full from the ground up rearrangement. But there is going to be a 10th month called December, as is correct. Just to kind of clarify.
Just to clarify.
Just to clear up any confusion about that.
Yeah. And speaking of which, we have a cool guest this week. Someone who, and we're also going to we're doing another episode of the history series. And before we kind of get into the topic of that, to intro our guest, good friend of all the pods, and also one of the hosts of Chapo Trap House, Matt Christman. Matt, how's it going?
Good. Thanks for having me.
We're really excited to have you on, and we're really excited to talk about the subject because you did a podcast that kind of talked about him recently, but also I think whenever we talk about posting and we talk about like the original posters, this guy comes up. We are, of course, talking on this episode about Martin Luther, and the the famous theses. I can't say that word, but the famous theses that was pinned to the door. And is kind of like one of these very important historical documents for lots of reasons we'll talk about. But crucially, whenever I was sort of Googling Martin Luther and the thesis, like, it doesn't take that long for someone to sort of say that, yeah, it was the original post or the original shit post. And I'd be interested, Matt, in like your opinions on like whether that is necessarily the correct way of thinking about it, but also like one of the things that we have spoken about is just like the tendency of posting and sort of the impulses to post and how that is seen throughout history and the ways in which that those impulses are kind of similar now, but in some ways back in history, like or in other historical periods, seemed more impactful. So yeah, I guess like as a starting point for people who may not kind of be aware of who Martin Luther is or why he's important to, I guess, this conversation, Matt, do you want to like give us like a brief kind of introduction as to who he is, and also just like why you were interested in him as part of like your other podcast series?
So Martin Luther, I would absolutely agree, was the original poster. He invented modern posting. He created the paradigm that said if you don't like something about the world, you can, if you write enough about it with enough passion and enough verve and enough commitment, the world will break open around you and around your critique. And we've been chasing that high really ever since. And so Martin Luther was a 16th century Franciscan monk who by the early 15 or by the late 15 teens was living in the Saxon city of Wittenberg. And he was preaching, he was ministering to the citizens, but he was deeply alienated from the church that he was a member of. Specifically, it's the way that it was treating the question of what got you into heaven, what was salvation. Because by this point, the Catholic Church, especially in Northern Europe, had become this transactional machine. And in order to raise revenue for things like St. Peter's Basilica and for the wealth of local bishops, was literally selling get out of purgatory early cards, and they were called indulgences. Indulgences were one of many ways that a person could intercede on behalf of their dead relatives to reduce the amount of time that they had to spend in purgatory before going to heaven. And because very few people imagined that they would go to hell during this period, because if you were part of Christendom, you were in this sort of gigantic bureaucratic structure that was guaranteed to get you to heaven eventually. But they invented this concept of purgatory to maintain the necessity of the church as an interceding body. So if you went to a pilgrimage site and saw a Saint Shinbone, that would get time off of purgatory. If you paid for masses for a relative to be said by a local priest, that would get you them out of purgatory. And if you bought these certificates, that got time out of purgatory. And Luther was incredibly bothered by this. He thought that it was perverting the entire concept of salvation, and was distorting people's understanding of what God was, what grace was. So he started trying to push back against what the church was doing. And he started doing that in the way that religious scholars like him traditionally did, which was to go through the channels of academic debate. Before his thesis, the theses on indulgences were posted, he had another bunch of theses about the scholastics and their concepts of salvation and their fixation on good works as an expression of salvation. And he put those through the regular channels and tried to initiate an academic disputation. And nobody really cared. It was pretty much ignored. But when he went after indulgences, which were a load-bearing financial structure of the church, and did so by issuing the theses not only in the form of the dramatic list nailed to the door of the Wittenberg Cathedral, but also published them in vernacular German instead of in scholarly Latin. He broke open this logjam around the church that had existed for a while, and people who had never really had words for their disquiet with the church found them in the form of Luther's writings. And the Reformation starts as a grassroots movement of post readers, of people who read his posts that are coming off of printing presses, and in the towns of northern Germany, start spontaneously reorganizing their churches along the lines that he imagined. And eventually it becomes this unstoppable tide. And then the princes of the Holy Roman Empire start using it to their advantage, because the church that Luther envisions is one that would allow them to have more power vis-a-vis the emperor and Rome, and also to keep a lot of that money in their principalities instead of letting it go away in the form of indulgences. So, but all of this happens because of his posts. That's it. He wasn't a warrior. He wasn't a politician. He was a poster, first and foremost. And because of the culture of the emergent culture of literacy, and the first time really that you see in Europe mass literacy, and this technology of the printing press that facilitates fast transmission of messages across wide geographic areas, people are able to engage with these posts in a way that nobody ever had before. And because the question that he was posing was so vital to people, the destination of their soul, it created a market for printed material that hadn't really existed before. The printing press was generations old at that point, but printing industry by the time of Luther was still relatively small and very risky, because no one could anticipate demand for any printed material. But once Luther starts posting, he becomes a brand, and anything associated with him becomes incredibly attractive to consumers. And so a printing industry springs up all over Germany to put out Luther's content. And it has this revolutionary effect on Western civilization. And so I think we've really all been chasing that high ever since.
Okay, so that is a fantastically rich introduction. There are a couple of things that I wanted to pick out before we kind of talk a bit more about his sort of social and cultural context and the stuff that he was actually writing, or if you like, that he was posting about. Fine, if we insist. The last time we did one of these episodes, we talked about Peter Abelard, and we were talking about the ways in which, specifically the mechanisms by which people before the printing press are distributing their material and sort of how that works. And our guest explained to us that how that worked was it was written up on the basis of hearing sermons, mainly within universities, like wherever, like in whatever capacity that might be, because some universities were under royal charter, some universities were connected with the church, some universities were set up by the students themselves. There was a kind of great kind of diversity of type of university, even in that period, and even in the kind of 2 centuries before. So they started being sort of written up at university, and then they started getting kind of passed around, and people went to see sermons, and then if they liked the sermons, it got written up. But this is much less speedy, much less reach, much more, much less kind of accuracy in reproduction. It's a whole different kind of cultural production. But what I'm interested in, and also of course the printing press, it's like this is new in Europe, but it's not new in the rest of the world. They had like I think the first automated printing press was maybe like 100 years before, but that was in Korea, and in China they were doing the kind of the woodblock printing. But obviously, like, it's important that this is a new technology for Europe. But what I think is interesting is how someone like Luther is taking advantage of these new technologies and using them to form kind of sort of communities, both intellectual and religious communities around himself. I think that is like a kind of interesting thing to kind of try and pick at a little bit, and whether or not that was his intention, or whether or not he saw this new technology or newish technology as just a way to reach as many people as possible. I was wondering if you thought that his intention all along was to start a movement, and to start a kind of a community of readers, in the way that there would have been a kind of new community of consumers of the news, say.
I think he wanted to reach people in authority in the church at first,
Yeah.
who weren't listening to him.
Sure.
And the publication of the material was a way to force them to pay attention, because his original vision was to have the church see the error of their ways through his obviously correct interpretation, because that was how he felt about it. Like, he had discovered the true nature of faith and divinity, and what the scriptures actually meant, and that when confronted with this, the church would be forced to reform. And that was the original goal. And it was only after that the church officials responded by denying it, by eventually excommunicating him, that he decided, okay, I guess there's going to have to be a new church, a new purified church, that will have to come into conflict with this fallen church, which actually turns out run by the devil. Turns out it's Antichrist in Rome. I didn't think that at first, but they've proven it to be the case. And then he set about gaining the supporters, specifically the most powerful people in the empire, to create a structure that could support a new church and defend itself against Rome and the Holy Roman Empire.
So it was, as you said, it was a grassroots movement, but its target were the structures and apparatus of power, and he had powerful supporters, right?
Yes, he was only able to survive those early years of confrontation with the church because the elector of Saxony, where he lived, who lived in Wittenberg, Frederick the Wise, they called him, supported him and defended him, even though he was a Catholic who never publicly converted and who had thousands of relics in the Wittenberg Cathedral, which were like the pride of his collection. But he protected Luther after the Diet of Worms, when he refused to recant in front of the Holy Roman Emperor, and he was in danger of being declared an outlaw and a subject of execution by anyone who came across him. Frederick the Wise staged a fake kidnapping of him and secured him in a castle, where he started translating the New Testament into German, and also sent tons of correspondence out and about to supporters. And while he was in that castle, the movement just spread out of his control. In fact, while he was away in Wittenberg, a bunch of people showed up. These prophets, the Zwickau prophets, these three guys who were not ordained priests, they were not religious scholars. They were just three people who were seized by the Spirit, showed up in Wittenberg and started preaching much more radically than Luther did about how if we are saved by God's grace, then we don't need the church, but then we also don't need these structures of noble control that dominate our lives. And Luther was frantically writing to his associates in Wittenberg, telling them to get these guys to shut up. We didn't want that. This isn't what it means. Stop that. No. And that's one of the most
helping. Stop helping.
Yeah, because as soon as it emerges and gets beyond his control, other people start doing what Luther did, looking at the Bible with their own heart and trying to come to understand what it means through their own interaction with it, and came to different conclusions than Luther did, which he found absolutely galling and infuriating, because that was not right. They were clearly incorrect. They had to be inspired by the devil because he knew the correct answer to these. And one of the things that makes Luther the first real poster is his incredibly venomous invective. He was not polite about his condemnation of people he thought were doing wrong. He used crude language, insults, anything, the kind of stuff anyone who's been on a forum or on a social media page is absolutely familiar with. He was, in fact, there is a website that has a Luther insult generator, where you can just click on a button and it will pop up from his writings an insult that he was hurling at somebody. And I got a few here.
Yeah, tell us.
We should roundly denounce you, the devil's messengers, as rascals, villains, poisonous evil worms. Or even if you are good friends of ours, we should denounce you as mad fools and stupid persons.
Oh, that's good. That's really good. Yeah.
You blubber and writhe along with all the devils in hell.
That'd go down well in the group chat.
Yeah, no, I know, I really like that. I'm coming round to this guy. I sure hope he didn't say anything bad, because we wouldn't want to have to disavow old Luther just when I'm getting to like him.
Yeah, like he wrote a pamphlet called "Against the Roman Papacy: An Institution of the Devil," and in it he wrote, "You are such outrageous, shameless blockheads."
That's good. Yeah, that's really good. It's straying into kind of compound swearing, but I think he holds back at the last minute.
Well, and again, you got to give him credit for being the first one.
Yeah, exactly. If he invented it, then it's like you can't really critique him on those grounds. Would he have been familiar with the work of kind of prior sort of proto-Protestant types? Would he have been familiar with like the Lollards, or would that just not have reached him?
Well, he obviously was very well read, but I think the thing that really catalyzed his opposition to the church as it was not the work of any specific proto-Protestant group, but Erasmus's publication of the Greek New Testament, and encountering the Bible in a new translation was really sobering for him, because it showed just how many of the institutions and traditions of the church were not scripturally based. And it was that disconnect that really gnawed at him. And then seeing a path to salvation become a a literal fiscal transaction just became too much to bear.
So it was his primary objection to the idea of a church of the church as business.
Yeah.
I had a question about the thesis. Sorry, Phoebe, were you going to say something?
No, I was going to ask a question about the indulgences, just because I think it's such a fun idea.
Yeah.
I love that it's like kind of pre-sale tickets or like or like speed cameras in really kind of like low traffic areas. It's just like
go ask that, because I also have some thoughts on it. Also based on the fact that like what I realized when I was reading this was that Shia Islam basically does have indulgences. And so I could prime myself up to become like Shia Martin Luther, but I can talk about that once you ask the question.
Okay, well, honestly, I'm desperate to hear about that, to be honest with you. But something I think is like super interesting about the conception of kind of heaven, hell, and purgatory around this period, and in this kind of in the period before, is that people, I think, have formed the idea now that purgatory is a kind of limbo waiting room, but that's not right, is it? Purgatory is just as terrible as hell. It's just you're not there for eternity. You're there for like a period of time while your soul's getting cleaned, as is my understanding. Yeah. And it is such a wonderful idea that this institution, which has so much control over every single sort of structure and aspect of people's lives. It has both kind of cultural, social, and sort of spiritual authority, that they're still like, yeah, but there is a way of getting round this stuff. There is a way of expunging your sins, and that's by giving us money. And you can see why somebody who is taking both their spirituality and like the spirituality of the community around them would say, but that's bullshit. Either you're going to pre-hell or you're not. You shouldn't be able to buy your way out of it. That's obvious bullshit. And I think it's a really interesting thing to have come up with, and it is in a way surprising that there was that the kind of resistance to it was in kind of these very kind of, sort of small, contained, obviously, which then sort of grew up and spread about, but just the idea that they were just like, yeah, this is fine. This is a good solution to this, and people were just like, yeah, this does sound reasonable.
Well, interestingly, it was not the concept of purgatory was not emphasized evenly across Western Christendom. It was much more fixated upon in the places that became Protestant in Northern Europe. And I honestly think part of that is because it was cold and sucked out. It's unpleasant to be around. So you kind of you have to have some sort of tally, for imagining a path to get to heaven, as opposed to in the sun-drenched climes of Southern Europe. But yeah, they invented purgatory, which is something that a guy like Luther would see from reading the Testament and finding no evidence of it in the Bible itself, and then they created this way to get out of it, and it validated the necessity for a church. You need us to get out of purgatory, and
because it's not enough just to be a good and observant person. You're still fucked.
But the thing is that it wasn't really like that, because common people, and this was what Luther was really galled by, common people believed that they were buying their way out of purgatory. They were only indirectly doing that, because it really was more of a pay it forward situation.
I see.
You could not get indulgences to get yourself out of purgatory because you hadn't died yet.
Oh, okay.
You could only do it to get relatives who had passed out of purgatory earlier. But the idea was, well, if I've done that for all of my relatives,
then they're going
then
to do
after
that
I
for
die,
me.
my descendants will do it for me.
Okay, so it's like a kind of targeted random acts of kindness thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was a way to maintain like a socially connected and bonded institution. Like it extends throughout time from the ancestors to descendants, and I'm just a part of that chain. But they were also, though, and Luther pointed this out, happy to let people think, yeah, buy that thing and you'll get out of purgatory, because what's the difference? As long as they're dropping their silver into the coffer, it doesn't really matter what they think.
I mean, it's very similar in some ways to Shia Islam, where like it's not quite comes, but there's another term for it and I can't remember in my head. But if you sort of like donate money in the name of like a certain sort of Shia saint, then the idea is that like you can either sort of pay for the past sins of a family member or like someone of a previous generation, or some people sort of use it so they'll sort of pay the money as part of their kind of like zakat payment, largely on the basis that like I don't think I fucked up, but if I have, then this is just some insurance money to like make sure I kind of get my place in heaven. And that money is sort of used to sort of train like religious scholars in like Iran and stuff, and kind of like just to sort of work on various projects which are connected to like Shia Islam and everything. I can't remember what it's called, and like I feel really bad that I can't remember it. But when I was reading, I was like, oh shit, this is exactly the same. Not least because like my parents keep telling me I need to pay this money because they're genuinely quite worried for my soul. So
that's super interesting. Is there some kind of penalty for not paying it?
No, because I think it's still like technically a voluntary payment, but it's one where like you'll sort of be told that you're never quite sure whether like you'll be accepted into heaven or not. So best to be on like the safe side. Or if people like genuinely know that they've kind of like one of our family members was just genuinely quite a horrible person, then I'll pay like this amount of money in the name of like one of the imams, and it'll be and kind of it'll help, or it might sort of contribute to cleansing them of their sins. Again, I don't know too much about like the actual kind of like theological background behind it, but very, very similar, and did very much make me think that like what they really needed was a piece of paper pinned onto the door. But actually on that point, like one of the questions I had about the thesis, partly maybe we can start with like what does the thesis actually say? Matt, you sort of like you mentioned it like in your beginning intro, but I think I'd love to sort of know more about the details that maybe people don't kind of don't pay as much attention to beyond the indulgences. But the second was a thing that I read, which was about the idea that even though Martin Luther like sent the pamphlet, he didn't necessarily there's a good chance that he didn't actually pin it to the door of the church. And I wondered what your thoughts were on that, and that in terms of
it has
posting.
been a controversy. I think that at this point the consensus is that he probably did. He might not have. He probably did. But what's really interesting is that the idea of the pinning of the thesis on the cathedral door as the start of the Reformation doesn't really become popular understanding until its 100-year anniversary in 1617, when Frederick, the Elector of the Palatinate, who was a prince of the Holy Roman Empire, the only Calvinist, hilariously enough, prince who was had a very ambitious project to claim power in the Holy Roman Empire, funded a German-wide series of parades, plays, processions. He minted commemorative coins around the 100-year anniversary, specifically of the pinning of the thesis onto the cathedral door, as part of his general propaganda campaign to advance his stature in the Holy Roman Empire. And it was at that point that it became understood that this was the beginning of the Reformation, this maybe mythical event. I think he probably did put it up there, but if he had just put it up there, it would not have been a Reformation. It was the publication to a mass audience that made it happen.
That's really interesting. So like it was so in like the kind of contemporary period, it was not that was not how it was regarded at all.
I mean, it was one event among many. I mean, like we said, he'd already made one thesis disputation to his higher ups before that had been ignored, but it was also a part of this protest against the church. And then, it goes past that event too. And it's only retrospectively that you can take the specific moments in this flow get pinned as the beginning of something.
Yeah. And how was it received at the time, in fact?
It was hostily received, obviously, by the church, and most of the princes of the empire, many of whom would end up becoming Lutheran, were not too thrilled about this, because an attack against the church's authority was an attack against their authority. But it was enthusiastically taken up by theology students in Germany, and many of the literate urban population, who would be the ones reading these things out of bookstalls. And the first real Reformation happens with the spontaneous reorganization of churches in cities, where they turf out their old priests, elect their own, and elect priests on their own, and reorganize their churches. And the princes stand kind of aloof from this for a long time. What ends up getting them on to co-opt Luther and to endorse a Lutheran reformation of their churches, in a lot of cases, was the Peasants' Revolt of 1525, because while Luther wanted the church to be reformed, and ideally reformed from within, but then replaced from without if necessary, he had no real problem with the feudal structure as such. In fact, his attempt to reform the church is really an attempt to save feudalism. But once this critique became generalized, a lot of people took it much farther, like those Zwickau prophets I talked about, but other priests, other itinerant and fixed preachers took it further and said, made the connection, like, if the church is not necessary to intercede on our behalf, if we are saved by God's grace, then are we not truly able to conduct our own affairs without being beholden to noble lords? And this was a period of intense famine and the imposition of an attempt to reimpose harsh tenant or rents and to enclose common lands in Germany at this time. And by 1625, a bunch of peasants in the middle of Germany revolted in piecemeal, but eventually tens of thousands of them, against the authority of the church and their feudal lords. And Luther was horrified by this. He did not want that to happen. And just as it took a while for the princes to get a response to this. They were taken off guard, and it took them a while to muster the necessary military force to put down these rebellions. And just as they were doing it, after having fought off and delayed the peasants wherever they could, just as they were full-on massacring them, Luther published a pamphlet called "Against the Lying, Murdering Hordes of Peasants," where he says these people are brigands and criminals, and they should be killed wherever they are found. And that actually did a lot to damage Luther's credibility among common people who had responded to the Reformation. In fact, he got stoned at a town that he was visited after that. But it convinced a lot of the princes of the empire that the Reformation was here to stay, and they would much rather have Luther's version of it than like Thomas Munsters, who was one of the priests, the preachers who inspired the Peasants' Revolt.
So, did the princes have any influence on the structures of the church, or was it a more of a kind of mutually beneficial arrangement between different structures of power?
Well, the idea, and it was obviously, like, as I said, Luther didn't go into this with an idea of what a different church would look like, But when it became clear that one would have to be built, the structure that ended up emerging was one where the magistrates, the princes of a given territory, would take over the role that had previously been held by the Pope and by the Holy Roman Emperor of appointing bishops, appointing priests, and then also seeing to, this was very important, seeing to the literacy of the citizen. The Lutheran territories had a big school building spree in a way to promote literacy to the common people so that they could encounter the Bible on their own. But yeah, the idea was that, well, Luther he didn't really trust the princes. He thought they were mostly selfish scumbags. He also did not see any alternative to them because there had to be some structure of hierarchy to promote virtuous life, to promote biblical literacy, to promote the civic engagement that you need to have a church. And so they were the best possible stewards of that.
Did he have a sense of divine appointment of the nobility, or is that not really, or is that not really something that he was
I
into?
think that was one of those things that was beyond conscious thought. Like that was deep ideology that God had clearly ordained the rulers to rule, or else they wouldn't be ruling.
And I just wondered if any of that had started to kind of decay around this time with just with different kind of competitive claims to authority, just like all over Europe during this period. Whether anyone responded to that with is there maybe a sense of kind of competing claims to authority? Because if there is, then how can that be divine appointment? Does that make sense?
The peasant rebels obviously had decided that maybe they were not destined to be divinely demanded to be, prostrate before these people. There were a number of more radical Protestant sects that emerged that attempt to challenge worldly structures of power. The one that none of the mainstream currents of Protestantism accepted, the one that was outside of everyone's bound of acceptance, were the Anabaptists. Because while Luther denied a number of the sacraments of the Catholic Church as not being biblical, and the Swiss Calvinists who came a little later extended that even further, and Luther and the Calvinists broke over the Eucharist, which Luther insisted had a divine presence to it, but which the Swiss said no, they can't be. Ulrich Zwingli did a debate with Luther where he said, it says in the Bible, Jesus is at the right hand of the Father, which means he can't be in the bread because he can't be at two places at once. But Luther had this sense that there was something in the Eucharist, I think because he was trying to hold on to that old Catholic social church that the Calvinists were in the process of dissembling in their different economic and social context. But the one thing that both of them agreed on is infant baptism, which is also not in the Bible, was sacrosanct. That there would be, they're not going to stop baptizing babies because the baptism of a child is an introduction into a political world as a subject. And the people who came and said, actually, no, you should have to willingly make the choice as a free believer to take on baptism into a church. They became known as Anabaptists, and they were outlawed basically everywhere that they emerged. In Switzerland, the penalty for espousing Anabaptism was to be tied up and thrown in the river. And but they existed as this radical fringe on the margins of European society until there was a coup in the city of Munster, where Anabaptists took power through the civic administration, and they were very quickly surrounded by a papal military force and besieged, and over the course of a year went through this millenniary frenzy of starvation and forced polygamy and execution of unbelievers that resulted in the leaders being tortured, murdered, and then hung from cages in the cathedral in the city as a warning to anyone else. And the only real, after that, the only concentrated elements of Anabaptists in Europe were small groups of people who were able to live together on the lands, usually of sympathetic nobles, and who largely emigrated to North America in the 17th and 18th centuries. Like the Mennonites and Amish are all remnants of the Anabaptist movement.
Oh, that's
of
so
Europe.
interesting. Oh, that's super interesting. I was going to ask some further questions about like just like stuff about the Eucharist. Like these are like debates which are going on and have been going on for centuries. What like the exact nature of the exact nature of transubstantiation and the exact nature of God and the connection between the who is the Father, who is the Son, who is the Holy Ghost, etc. So presumably he had a kind of significant debate tradition to draw on, or did he see himself as the one guy who had got it right and wasn't influenced by anyone?
I mean, he obviously was influenced by other writers. Like Erasmus was an important figure, although they broke uh, with each other because Erasmus was not willing to go against the church. He was not willing to come into conflict, and Luther eventually decided that he was a coward. And Erasmus's point about Luther was that Luther's entire conception was a bunch of contradictions, a bunch of paradoxes between things like free will and God's grace that he was comfortable to just live within and to struggle with, and have that stand in for a life of religious piety. And Erasmus said, Luther's paradox is, I would not be willing to be burned for any of them. But Luther did become convinced of his singular appointment as the arbiter of biblical truth. And that is why he became so hostile to not just the papacy, but to reformers who went against his understanding of the church. I just clicked on the Luther insulter again. You are desperate, thorough arch rascals, murderers, traitors, liars, the very scum of all the most evil people on earth. You are full of all the worst devils in hell. Full, and so full that you can do nothing but vomit, throw, and blow out devils.
Amazing.
He also loved talking about shit. He was fixated on feces. He talked about how having the devil smell his shit.
He's a true poster.
Yeah, exactly. Scatological. He had the embryo of everything that became the language of literary combat. You cowardly slave! You corrupt sycophant with your sickening advice.
These days, people just post an image of a Wojak. They don't have like a way with words anymore. I think that's really sad. But what I was going to ask was about, because I think the point that you made about Luther sort of thinking that he ultimately like sort of has it right. I don't know whether like the right kind of way to put it is he sort of like solved the contradictions, or he sort of refuses to kind of believe that those contradictions exist. But I suppose I wondered about, and this kind of ties in not only to like the posting tendency, but just the idea of the thesis as a post in and of itself. Because obviously one of the things that you can't like, the the sort of longevity of this moment of time and in history in part comes from the advent of like the printing press and the ways in which like the written word and its distribution is kind of much more widespread in this moment than before. And I guess I wondered, because from what I've read, and I don't know if I'm wrong, so please correct me if I am, uh, Luther didn't like print out loads of copies of this and sort of like distribute them around the town, right? Like the whole kind of its distribution wasn't really because he intended it to be that way, and that sort of made me wonder whether he was necessarily expecting, or whether he intended to kind of be the face of this sort of like anti-indulgences movement. I know, as you've mentioned, like there have been previous people, there were previous like figures who spoke out against indulgences, maybe not in as kind of like as direct a way as Martin Luther does. But I guess my question is like, did he kind of do this going out to be like, these guys, these guys who have sort of spoken out about indulgences before, they're pussies, I've got it right, I'm going to go for it. And or is this kind of like virality, so to speak, accidental?
It was he once he started publishing things, he took a very keen interest in seeing his works published and published well. He was actually very frustrated with initially because there was only one press in Wittenberg, which was it existed as a vanity project of the elector, and there was the printer there was a kind of slow, dowdy, not terribly inspired guy who didn't work very quickly, and Luther was very frustrated with his pace of output. And eventually, they had to outsource some publication of some work to other publishers in other cities to get them out as fast as they wanted them to. And he would also look at the layouts and he would criticize things. If he didn't like the type, if he thought it was sloppy, he would be very annoyed and he would offer corrections. He was very hands-on in the publication of the works. He grasped very quickly that the success of his project was going to come down to how effectively they were able to get these things off of printing presses and into people's hands. And also the visual appeal necessary to get people to want to buy them.
That's interesting. So was there a kind of process of sort of bookbinding, and was there a marketing aspect to his work that he was taking an interest in?
There was another guy in Wittenberg, Lucas Cranach, who was a painter and illustrator.
Is that Cranach, the one who did the painting of Venus with the hat?
I don't know about a Venus with a hat.
Okay, I'm gonna look that up. Please keep telling me about this.
He is pretty famous. That's probably him. But he had this huge facility in Wittenberg, and he ended up becoming a close collaborator with Luther. And his front pieces became very crucial to the popularity of Luther because it provided this eye-catching visual tableau that people responded to and helped them want to buy the stuff. So, and pretty soon, portraits of Luther became things that people bought, and so Luther's name and Luther's face became a brand that could guarantee sales. And Cranach's helped create the visual vocabulary.
So he's not the first. He's not the first poster. He's the first influencer. Yeah. That's super interesting. This is Cranach that I'm thinking of. Yeah, it's a painting of Venus. She's wearing a big hat. Cupid is being stung by wasps and is complaining to her. It's a good painting. Good painting.
Yeah.
Worth a.
I was just thinking about the idea of Luther as an influencer. I think is actually is very funny.
Yeah, like the idea of him having merch. I think that you could.
He did. Yeah. He was also signing autographs for people. People would send them pictures of his face and ask him to return it with his signature on it. This was all the very first modern celebrity in a lot of ways of Europe.
Yeah.
He also invented podcasting in a way.
Oh no!
Because one of his publications was a book. This was after he'd been. This is after he had become this institution. Was a book called Table Talk, and it was a transcription of his conversations that he had at his dinner table. with guests.
Oh my God.
And there would be a student there dutifully writing down what he said, and
Yeah,
then they compiled it and turned it into this book, and it's him just
that's
shooting the
so
shit.
funny.
So what if
That's
we
so
had like,
funny.
so what if we like, okay, like it doesn't have any topic. It's just like the guys just like shooting the shit. And that's it. That's the show. That's the whole show.
Yeah,
Amazing.
he invented that basically.
That's incredible. And like honestly, I'm not sure that the answer to this is like necessarily completely clear, but just wondering if you had any thoughts about it. Where did he think that his kind of revelations about the nature of divinity and the nature of the church and the nature of the final destination of the soul, where did he think it came from? Did he think that he had reasoned it out, or did he report visions or being addressed directly by God or an angel or something of that kind?
Well, there's an apocryphal tale that he received a revelation about the nature of grace, which is what really felt liberated him, because he had been tormented by his doubt that a wretch like him could be saved, and that made his relationship with his religion very fraught.
Mm.
And he felt eventually he came to this epiphany about grace, and God's grace is this free gift that we are free to accept.
Mm.
And the apocryphal story is that he had this revelation while on the toilet, training to shit, because Luther was notorious for his constipation, which honestly might explain his
fixations.
scatological fixation.
Yeah.
He was always sitting on a dump that he couldn't get out.
Yeah,
but
well, I was going to say he's like had experience going through hell, and the idea that someone can simply pay their way out of it is just unfathomable, and he's not having it.
So that's what he
But I
thinks.
do
That's
like
what
the
he thinks
idea
an
that
indulgence is. It's people paying. It's people paying to not have constipation.
I do like the idea of him being unburdened and in that
Yeah.
release coming into this recognition. I don't think he ever testified to like seeing visions or
Okay.
anything, but he did have a few like religious epiphanies. The big one was when he was a law student before he became a monk. He was walking to his family's house from his university, and he got caught in a rainstorm. And he took shelter under a tree while lightning was flashing all around him. And he vowed that to God that if he was spared, that he would dedicate his life to the church.
Mm.
Again, that might be apocryphal rewriting of history from a later perspective, but that's how he narrativized it.
Because it's interesting because I always associate stories of kind of visions and kind of explicitly divine inspiration as being sort of more strongly associated with kind of female religious figures, certainly in the kind of late medieval period. But I don't know whether that's a kind of vibes only opinion or whether that has any kind of basis. I'm just interested in where he said that, where he thought that it came from, because he was educated to the best possible standard of the time, right? He was sent off.
Yeah.
Wasn't he sent off to? Yeah, he was sent off to law school and to train as a theologian. Wasn't his family were extremely disappointed that he decided to become a monk? That's right, isn't it?
Yeah, they his father was a independent miner who became a town grandee, but he was always just a step ahead of getting his claim taken because he never owned the mine that he worked. It was always leased. So he was just precariously in this new middle class. His son becoming a lawyer and then becoming a imperial bureaucrat was the ticket to the family's long-term financial stability, and for him to turn his back on it was a real blow.
Because that's interesting, because that's interesting to me as well, that because he wasn't from a well-off or noble family, so it's interesting that he so violently rejects the idea of social reorganization alongside church reorganization. Is it because he doesn't want to associate himself with it?
Well, he thinks it's anarchy. He thinks that if we don't have the social order, that it will only be replaced by licentiousness, by everyone pursuing their own base fallen urges, because we are all sinners. We need to be directed towards the good, and that our placement in a society of orders is what disciplines us in that direction.
What other kinds of things would he have studied before his revelation and before becoming a monk?
Well, I mean, he dropped out of law school and then went into the theology. So he would have gotten the theological education, which is the Greek language, which he was proficient in, and the suite of the liberal humanities that were taught at these universities at that time. So yeah, that's what he would have known. He would have had the same education in that respect as pretty much any other churchman of the era.
So if he's studying the liberal humanities, that includes Aristotle, presumably.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did he have any thoughts about the use of pagan figures in education, or was this just not something he was interested in at all?
I actually don't know.
Oh, fair enough. No, I'm just interested. I just want because there is a while we're talking about sort of debates around kind of purgatory, there was a debate about whether or not pre-Christian individuals were knocking around hell, or whether they weren't, because it wasn't like they had the choice. And this is his primary objection. Well, not his primary objection, presumably, because his primary objection was founded on again, like when you're talking about how his feeling about the divine right of kings is just, it's like unconscious. It's like it's kind of part of the furniture and part of the atmosphere, and that's presumably the case with hostility to Germany's Jews as well. It's a kind of structurally, culturally, socially entrenched thing. But as far as I can tell, his objection to the Jews was, of course they're not going to convert, because we have this terrible, corrupt, decadent church. But once we've come up with a new, better one, which is kind of gives edicts that an ordinary person can read and engage with, because of how central the language of the scriptures was to his ideas. But then after they had something better to convert to, and they still were like, no, thank you, that's when the hostility starts, right?
Yeah. His early writing on Jews is, like you said, it's like, who could blame them for not accepting Christianity when its representation is this fallen Luciferian church? But later in his career, he writes very hostile pamphlets calling for Jewish settlements to be burned, for the Jews to be persecuted, because they now had the option of a godly church that they were still continuing to deny, and therefore they needed to be punished for that.
Yeah, that's more posters behavior there, right? Like, okay, I get it. I get, like, you're not into it now, but now that I've said something, I feel like you should maybe be more into it. That's not to diminish the probable effects of that, of course, but yeah, that's super interesting. Yeah, I'm just interested. I'm interested, like, what his conception of who was going to be forgiven and who wasn't, and whether he thought that there was a kind of corrupting effect of studying pre-Christian figures, or whether that didn't sort of really come into it for him. But I'm sure he wrote about that somewhere. It feels like he did a lot of scribbling. He was a prolific poster. He was a forum power user.
Yeah. Well, I had like a quick question also, just about, in terms of him being a poster, and also one of the things that motivates posters throughout history is your haters, right? And I don't know.
His,
I don't
his
know.
haters were his motivators.
That's right. And you mentioned a few in terms of like the kind of people who sort of showed up after the 95 thesis and kind of like tried to do what he was doing, and he was like, no, you can't, like, I'm right and you guys like suck. Can you stop helping? But there was one guy who I was reading about very briefly this morning who I'd love to sort of find out more about, and I don't know whether I'm pronouncing his name correctly. Johann Tetzel, who
Yes.
was the pamphlets guy, but was supposed to be the kind of pro indulgences. And so
Well, he was
they
Johann
were having like
Tetzel
a
was
pamphlet war, right?
well, he was the Dominican friar who was in charge of the uh, indulgence campaign that set Luther off, because it was a specific campaign of
Right.
indulgences that
Okay.
was carried out by a local bishop who was trying to pay off the Pope for allowing him to hold 2 bishoprics, and he was going to pay it off in part by selling these indulgences. And the way they would do it is that they would commission a guy like Tetzel, who was a monk, to go around and sell them. And he was a traveling indulgence salesman. And he would go to towns, he would go to villages, and he would make his pitch to the people about why they needed to buy these things. And he would get a percentage. And uh, the thing that Luther's claim is that he would say a drop, every drop of a coin, when a drop of silver in a box rings, a soul from purgatory springs. And in the initial phase of his posting wars, Luther went all in on Tetzel and dragged him for filth, as the kids say. And Tetzel did try to defend himself at first, but he was just absolutely overwhelmed. All of the Catholic interlocutors who tried to engage Luther in the early days end up getting steamrolled, specifically in the marketplace. No one buys their pamphlets. They only buy Luther's pamphlets, owning them.
That feels like very sort of posters mentality. So I guess like what happened? Like, is there anyone who does show up who can like challenge Luther in any way? Like, yeah. So like I've been thinking a bit about just like posters and haters and like the kind of how they sort of feed off each other. And I guess the question that I have for Luther, we know about some of his haters, but what do his haters throughout time kind of look like? Do they change like as he becomes more famous? And like what are the things that they have issues with? Does anyone try to challenge him? Yeah, like what who are the haters and the motivators?
So one of his first big opponents in the public debate sphere was this guy Johann Eck. He was a professor of philosophy, and he attacked Luther on behalf of German Catholics, because one of the things that Luther had to his advantage was that he could paint the church as this foreign force, this Italian imposition on Germany. And Eck was a German, and he debated Luther in public in 1519, and then they continued their debate into the publishing world. But again, Eck could not hang with Luther in the world of the market. They just own the hell out of him. And then, as I said, he kind of broke with Erasmus over the degree of conflict that he was willing to have with the church. And eventually he ends up going from arguing with Catholics to arguing with other reformers who wanted to go farther or in different directions from him. He had a big disputation with Ulrich Zwingli from Switzerland. So he's fighting with everyone, essentially, except for the most doctrinaire Lutherans who agree with him on everything. So by the end of his life, he has condemned everyone who took the Reformation in any other direction than what he thought it should go.
That's so.
By the end, he kind of
yeah.
stopped fighting with the papacy because he no longer felt like it was a good faith opponent, it was it was literally Antichrist. So what's the point of arguing with Antichrist?
Yeah, and then what? Because what do you do when your
But
biggest
then he got
hater?
all of his arguing in against the people who were doing it wrong, who were doing Reformation wrong.
Yeah,
in a really strange
what do
way.
you do when your biggest hater turns out to be the Antichrist? That's like that. Like, surely you just sort of fall into a depression at that point.
In a very strange way, he's almost followed the path of like some of the new atheists who like start out kind of trying to be like logic guys, get like a lot of fame, and now and I've forgotten about a bunch of them, but like at least two of them recently, though they haven't sort of said that they've kind of converted to Catholicism, do basically say that all their opponents are in fact Satan, and that there's no point engaging with them because they like are different sorts of beings entirely. So yeah, I guess like maybe it's ultimately he follows the poster's journey, you know, and it's nice to see that sort of legacy has continued to other types of guys.
Well, it's what happens when you give a post to his own forum.
If you are fashioning a world entirely out of your own posts, you do eventually, it does eventually cut you off from everyone else.
Yeah, no, that's true.
For sycophants.
Yeah,
that's true. Maybe that's a good way to. That's a good place to end it. I think that's some sage
a good place to end
advice.
It. I mean, like because otherwise the only other thing I had to say was I just had this vision of people like crowding around the cathedral door and being like, can anyone tell me what that says? Because he blocked me. That's all I've got. That's all I've got to offer. So I think it remains only for us to thank Matt very, very much for coming on to talk to us about the first real poster.
Yeah, thank you so much, Matt. We really appreciate it. Obviously, I think most of our listeners will know you from like Chapo, but is there anything you want to plug or any other projects that you're working on that you reckon deserves some highlighting here?
Well, if anyone wants to hear more about Martin Luther and the Reformation and then the horrifying century of bloodshed that came after it, we've got a limited series that's wrapping up on the Chapo Patreon, Hell on Earth. Me and Chris Wade talking about just this stuff. Check it out if you're interested.
We'll put that in the show notes. I listened to some of it today. It was really good. I'm going to listen to the rest of it as I go back home tonight. Thank you very much for listening to this free episode. We have a Patreon as well, patreon.com/10K Post Podcast. We have lots of cool bonus episodes on there, lots of interviews, fun stuff. You have a good time, $5 a month. It helps us do this show and also helps us do it without advertising, which is really important to us. Phoebe, do you want to plug anything before you head out?
Sure. I have become more disciplined with putting things on my Substack, which is phoeberoy.substack.com. You can listen to me and Milo's Seinfeld podcast, which is Masters of Our Domain. And you can follow this show on Instagram, which I suggest you do because Twitter doesn't work anymore.
Yeah, do that. I keep forgetting to do that. Follow us on Instagram. We are going to be posting more on there for obvious reasons. This show is produced by Devon. Follow them at Devon_on_earth if you don't already. Also listen to Kill James Bond if you don't do that already. And on that note, let's close out. So until the next time, we'll see you later. Have a good one. Bye.
Bye.